Right. My name is Dr. Simon Workman. I am the Program Director of the English and History Program here at Carlow College, and this is part of our lunchtime sessions. Our guest today, we're very lucky to have Finbar Dwyer, a historian and creator of the Irish History Podcast, as you know, which is the most popular history podcast in Ireland. Finn has just been speaking to our second year students who are doing a career skills module as part of their English and history degree, and has proved, very informative for them. Just before we start, I just want to kind of talk about the structure of the meeting. So what I'm going to do is chat to Finn for about 20 minutes, and then give you an opportunity to ask some questions to him. If you can do that through the question and answer function or the chat function, I'll try to get to as many questions as I can, okay? So what I'll do now is I'll talk a bit about Finn and his career, just to sort of, I know a lot of you know of him, but just to sort of, those of you maybe who are encountering for the first time who he is and what he does. And then, as I say, I'll get into a chat with Finn, and then you guys have a chance to ask questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom, and the chat function. So, Finbar Dwyer, creator of the Irish History Podcast, but also someone who is an author and historian, and very engaged in public history. He's the author of 2 Irish history books, Witches, Spies, and Stockholm Syndrome, Life in Medieval Ireland, which was first published in 2013 and was republished by New Ireland in 2019. His second history book was 1348, A Medieval Apocalypse, War, Famine, and Plague in 14th Century Ireland. And even I think through the titles of those books, you can sort of tell why he's such a compelling historian. He has worked for the RTE and for RTE and BBC as both a researcher and a curator of content for programmes on Irish history. And he's also created the Kilkenny Famine Experience, for some of you maybe on, and the Dublin Famine Tour. So he wears a lot of hats. Most recently, he organised the Irish History Summit, which I know involved over 1,000 Leaving Cert students and their engagement with some historians who were at the absolute forefront of their field in topics related to Leaving Cert history. But he's best known for the Irish History Podcast, a podcast which, covers a really remarkable range of history, from the well-known sort of epoch-making events such as the Battle of Clontarf or the Easter 1916 Rising, to more particular lesser-known histories. 2 that I was particularly fascinated by was, he has a very interesting episode on the last witch that was killed in Ireland in 1895, and also has a very interesting series on divorce and sex magic in Irish medieval times in Brehon law. So there's a wealth of information in his podcast, and as I say, he covers a remarkable variety and range of history. He's also very topical. So just as lockdown began, a podcast that you might want to check out was on epidemics in Ireland, which was a really useful actual podcast to get at the start of the epidemic. So he's right up to date as well. So far, his show has been downloaded. Now he can tell me the specific data on this. At least over 5 million times is what I could gather, probably more at this point. And he's often listed in the sort of top 5, top 10 most essential Irish podcasts. So I think it was just 8 days ago, he was referenced in the RTE website as one of the 5 essential podcasts. And they described his podcast and his style as often unusual, regularly intriguing, and always fascinating. So hopefully we can replicate that today. So as I say, I'll start off with some questions, and then you guys will have a chance to ask your own questions. So first of all, Finn, talk about your journey from you're from Castlecomer, isn't it?
Yep.
Small boy in Castlecomer to biggest Irish history podcast in Ireland. How did that happen?
Well, thanks very much for having me. So I was always interested in history, and when I went to college, so I left Castlecomer Community School in 1999, and when I went to college, I actually studied archaeology. and Greek and Roman civilization, which is kind of a course on Greek and Roman history, classical kind of culture, and archaeology. Then I did a master's in archaeology after that, and then I went working in archaeology, which is something I kind of always wanted to do, I suppose. Although I always had more of an interest in history, and I've never quite understood fully why I didn't study history. But anyway, I worked in archaeology for 4 years, then on and off, until about late 2008, and then around that time, as I suppose everyone will remember, the country was hit by the recession, and archaeology was one of the most affected industries. With, like, I've read like that 85% of archaeologists were unemployed by the end of 2009. I think it was. I'm not 100% sure that's accurate, but it was certainly the vast majority of archaeologists were unemployed, and I was one of them. And around the same time, though, I got quite ill. I got kind of an unusual form of Crohn's disease, and I actually wasn't able to work for about 5 or 6 years after that. And it was just around this time that podcasts were starting to become a thing. They had existed kind of in the music genre, but were very, very like at the fringes of the internet, I suppose might be a way to describe it. But around 2009-10, it had started to become, I suppose, what you might call a subculture. And then within that, history podcasts quite quickly established themselves as one of the big genres. So like within podcasting, certainly at this point, you would have had like true crime was becoming a huge, one of the biggest genres. And then like, I suppose, discussion shows, and then history would have been big as well. And some of the biggest, some of the biggest podcasts were history, and shows like the history of Rome or hardcore history. And I was listening to them, and I would have been reading a lot of history because I did. And my brother actually at the time, or he still is he was in a band though, and he was kind of pointed out that actually the recording end, which I would have known nothing about, was easy enough to do, and that and I started to make a podcast largely just to keep my mind occupied while I couldn't work. And it grew from there. Initially, I started on what I suppose is my greatest interest is medieval history, and particularly like the late medieval period around like the 14th century, which I wrote my second book on, is something that I'd be really interested in. And I've covered a good bit of the history of the Norman invasion and kind of the emergence of the structures of I suppose, late medieval Ireland. But since 2016, I shifted into a more modern period. Particularly the famine was always something that really did interest me. I think it's an overlooked period in our history, but it's probably the most important event, or not probably, I think it is the most important event in our history. And at the moment, I'm covering the War of Independence. That's partly, I suppose, like, I want to say it, in its own way, a commercial decision. There's more people, and like, I suppose, because as a historian, I'm not funded by any institution, I have to obviously try and gain, you have to eat, and more people are interested in modern history now. I'm hoping the audience has grown over the last couple of years, so I am hoping to go back and look at medieval history again, and like the very end of the medieval period, because as I say, that would be the thing that appeals to me most of all.
Just on that, what is it about that period that, you know, that drew you to it? Because it is, you can tell from your research, obviously, in your publication, that is something that was your first love, I think, historically. So what was it about that period?
Probably it's like I don't know, actually. I don't have a great, but I think it's probably, like, I always was interested in the medieval period, and it probably started out with some like quasi-fantastical notion of like Robin Hood or something. But I don't know, certainly in terms of when I started to read like medieval history and like academic tracks of medieval history, it is something that really, it's a very interesting time actually, because you can see the emergence of the modern world and the very, very earliest traces of things like, you know, be it like the market as we would recognize it, even individuality in a modern sense of it, does actually start to make its presence felt in very small ways, but it is there. And I think I'm really interested in that, in the emergence of things like the modern state and where we come from. And I think certainly that the medieval world is is it, like, you know, it's in a long sense.
Okay. Because I imagine being a podcaster and being a popular podcaster, I would imagine that you're constantly struggling with trying to sort of pursue your own historical interests and history that you think is important, but also trying to meet a demand for periods of time which people are particularly interested in. And we all know what those periods of time are. You know, Nazi Germany is always a sort of a big theme. Is, you know, if you put it, as you said to me, if you put a swastika on a book, it'll sell. You know, that is it difficult to sort of tread that line between sort of meeting your audience and what they want, and maybe trying to direct them towards something you think is really interesting?
I don't think so. I think it's like, I think like the longer I'm doing it, the more I'm kind of convinced it's with proper structure and research and spending the time to find the historical figures you'll structure any narrative around, you can make any epoch of history interesting. Now, you do always face barriers. Like the War of Independence in Ireland is unquestionably the most popular story in our history, and that's because I suppose it's the foundation story of the Free State anyway. And that said, actually, like a lot of people enjoyed the series I did on the famine, but judging on feedback was because that they didn't actually know the history. They'd heard of the famine, but didn't really know, like they knew 1 million people died and 1 million emigrated, but didn't actually understand what it was, how it like played out, what exactly had the British government done and not done. So they enjoyed, and it was like, I kind of went into it in a lot of detail over like 25, 26 episodes, like to break down those policies. And so I think a lot of it can be also around the framing of it, like, you know, as well. But there's no question, the further you go back from the present, the less. I think it's often the way people feel about history as opposed to the actual stories themselves, where people assume that somehow they wouldn't be able to engage with medieval history or even history before that, because, you know, it's almost overly intellectualized or something. I don't know what it is, but people feel this inability to relate to it, which I think if they actually gave it time, well, I suppose I'm bound to say that, haven't I? It's like, but yeah, I suppose it is the more contemporary something is, the more we can see ourselves. Like,
yes,
the War of Independence, our grandparents fought in it. It makes it obviously more interesting.
Yeah. So just to return then to that journey you were talking about. So, you know, you've taken an interest in podcasting, you've started the podcast. How do you get from just it's a hobby and it's something I like to do to it's a career and it's my full-time job and, you know, my whole sort of career is devoted to this? When did that sort of change occur?
It's the last 5 years, really. So about 2015, I was in a position where I was able to return to work. I had been, as I mentioned, I was unwell, and I decided that I wanted to see if I could make a career around the podcast. In 2015, it certainly wasn't big enough that you could just hope to make a career out of it, but maybe using it. And I decided I'd give it a couple of years. Rather, I didn't want to end up in 30 years' time going, God, that was something I would have loved to have done. And around the same time, there have been big changes in podcasting. People might remember the series Serial that investigated a crime in the US. Then there was West Cork, an investigation into the murder of Sophie Toscan de Plantier. And then Blind Boy, when he released his podcast. And the three of those were kind of really big, like groundbreaking podcasts, and served as gateways for people who hadn't listened to podcasts or didn't know what podcasts were. And they would listen to these, and then once you listen to one podcast, it's very easy to find a lot more. And they became very important. So around that time, the audience though was growing, and it's a slow process where I suppose the audience continued to grow, the monetization of it through advertising, through podcast platforms like Patreon that allow listeners to subscribe financially, were coming online as well. And that allowed like I'm trying to think of a specific time. I guess around 2018, it was really becoming obvious that this was going to be a potentially viable venture on its own, that the podcast itself, rather than being something I would be able to leverage into finding other work, would actually be the job itself, and that the audience would grow, and that financially as well, it would become viable.
Okay, and presumably lockdown has lockdown helped you grow, or has it made no difference?
Lockdown has had a huge impact on podcasting, good and bad, I think, from my perspective. So more people are listening to podcasts, although not necessarily. Some people have lost time. So people, for example, who got lots of kids at home and used to have maybe a 2-hour commute to and from work, there was essentially dead time, but they would be able to, listen to a podcast on their on the car or on the train or whatever, and they weren't able to do very much else. So that was time they could devote to that, and now that time is gone. But most people, by and large, are listening to more podcasts. On the flip side of that, a lot more people are producing podcasts. So the market is becoming more crowded. And if you're starting now and you don't have like, a celebrity name behind you, essentially, if you're not known already, it is very difficult, because it's not because necessarily your podcast isn't great. It's just that people won't be able to find it because there's 100 other podcasts ahead of us,
Gotcha. And obviously then, you came in probably at the start of this relatively new phenomenon in social media podcasting, because I think, certainly 10 years ago, I didn't know what a podcast was. I didn't know what it did. I didn't know how it worked. Now I listen to several podcasts every week, and I'm, into them. Yours among them. What was, in terms, so you in some ways, I suppose, maybe not that you're lucky, but you got in at the right time, I suppose, to develop your profile as a podcaster. And you're known, I suppose, like as I mentioned at the start, you're put into these sort of categories of essential podcast listening. What has been, or what is, I suppose, maybe your biggest challenge in terms of keeping this going, keeping that profile, in sort of keeping it relevant and keeping people coming back? Like, is that a challenge, or do you feel you find your niche? Or
yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and it's kind of it's a strange one, because it's very difficult to identify the problem, or not the problem, but like, but yeah, it's a constant worry. I suppose in the way that anyone has worry about if they run a business, whether the business will be successful, whether they're in a job and they're thinking of promotion or whatever it is. I think we all have those. What's a bit different about podcasting is that it's, as it moves forward, like I've seen it change so much over the last 10 years, over the last 5 years, and over the last year now. I found it very difficult to envisage where it's going to be in 5 years' time. And, that can be quite, I wouldn't say daunting, but it's just like, you do kind of wonder, like, where will my podcast, that's like an independent podcast, as in it's not made by RTE, it's not backed by any institution, where will that fit into a media landscape that's definitely has always favored big corporations? And yeah, so I suppose that is a concern. Sometimes it's a bit, I don't know, is the word, it can be daunting in that there's not a lot I can do about it, in terms of like, you can try and spot the changes coming and adapt with them, but they are, it does, I wouldn't say give me sleepless nights, but I think about it.
Yes. And do you follow a particular formula now? Have you developed a formula over time in terms of how you design a podcast, the length of it, how you structure it, what you want to sort of, what you want to do for its audience?
I would. I generally try and focus it around a story of an individual, because I think that's the way people relate to pretty much anything. No matter what you're trying to do, I think telling a story, and history is obviously particularly suited to this, when you find, and so if I'm talking about the famine, and I'm talking about like a specific event during the famine, I will try and find somebody that whose life symbolizes, or that aspect of their life symbolizes those events. And then you tell the wider story, maybe, and some of it could be complex enough. You're talking about maybe economic history or, economic decisions, and how a decision taken in London affects the economy in somewhere like Galway. And like that, so that's what I'm always, I suppose, trying to do if I'm talking about something like that. It's going off to try and find that person whose life is interesting and accessible, and finding that person and then telling the wider story through it. So that's what generally the way I'd approach it. Occasional episodes I do interview people, and that's obviously a completely different process, because you're more focused on who the person is and what the story they're going to tell is, and then maybe trying to focus again on that and on how you're going to make that, how you're going to ensure that the information comes out and that like that person engages the audience in a way that's accessible.
Yes. And on that topic of that type of history, I suppose, just you said in the previous interview, I wanted to make Irish history engaging for people who had little, if any, prior knowledge on a historical subject or topic. The aim was to create a podcast that was interesting, accessible, as well as relating more to the stories of particular individuals. So do you see yourself as sort of promoting a certain type of history or historiography as part of your work?
Yeah, like I generally, I suppose, in the broad scheme of things, I'm interested in social history and generally the concept of history from below. And I suppose the best way of saying it, the opposite of the great man theory of history that kind of strips history down into people like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Napoleon, whoever it is, whatever epoch it is, you'll find a history book that says that there was some man somewhere and everything happened because of him. And I don't think that tells a story, and I don't think it's particularly interesting. I don't think it's very useful. I don't think it explains very much about the past, and I think it's pretty boring because these great men tend to often be very similar. But what I find interesting is the dynamics in local communities, be it in, like you can see it in medieval history, all the way through to the present. And that's, I suppose, what interests me is like, how do those how does something that happens in a local community, somewhere like, say, for example, Castlecomer, where I grew up, how does that relate to some huge world-changing event? And like, what is the tension and the relationship between those?
I think that what you're saying, I think that's the way forward for history. I think personally that's those dates and the great man version of history, that's on the way out, I hope, because I agree it includes a whole vast populace and a whole vast form of society that we don't know anything about and we should know about. Maybe related to this idea about the way you teach history, and again, this is maybe a slightly cliche question, but what function do you think history still has for us or should have for us in 2021? Like, do you still think it's a vitally important discipline? You obviously do, but in what ways, perhaps, is it vitally important for us as a culture and as a society?
Well, I think history is going to become way more important than it is even now. And that's because I think, it's not necessarily for good reasons, but I think history is going to become very contested in the coming decade. I think we've seen fake news. We're going to see increasingly what you could call fake history. If you look at things like the emergence of the far right across the world, we've seen what the far right have done the last time they emerged in a very coherent force, that you get narratives of history that become, for example, extremely nationalistic, trying to prove that a nation did something. And I think that's largely been discredited by historical evidence. But I think we're going to see the reemergence of that, and essentially a fake history will emerge with that. And I think that's why history will become very important, is to kind of challenge, because some of those ideas aren't just abstract. They can have very real implications in terms of the type of society people may try and advocate for. I think history in general is very, very important in terms of how we understand ourselves, how we understand the past, and those things are not abstract. They very much shape where we position ourselves as we move into the future as a society. I think in terms of Ireland, the identity of people in general in this country are the unifying thing. One of the unifying things for people in Ireland is our relationship and our interest in the history of this island. And, you know, we're going to have a lot of debates, I would imagine, in the next 10 years about 32 counties, about reunification. And like history is going to be to the fore of that. And, you know, like where, for example, looking at where like Northern Ireland as a state emerged from, how that emerged, our relationship with history, challenging some of the really the ideas of truths that were handed down to us by our grandparents and great-grandparents, and challenging those within ourselves, and also challenging preconceived ideas of the past that will have been handed down. Like I'm saying this, like coming from 26 counties, like, but in the like in unionist communities in the north, like, you know, those two histories have to like meet each other somewhere. So like that's why I think history is going to become so important on that level. Aside from, I think, that bigger question of like that what we've seen with fake news, I think history is going to become this very contested space about as like that kind of alt-right. I don't think that's going away. I think it's going to become, and I think history is in that, like you can, I've seen it already in terms of some aspects of Irish history that are kind of being used and abused to bolster these type of arguments.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I totally take your point about both those issues, you know, the North-South question and also, you know, the alt-right revision of history, which is dangerous, because once we forget our history, then dangerous things tend to happen. We might open it up to questions now, and we've already had a question. And by the way, folks, this meeting is being recorded, so I'm not going to read out names to protect your data. So the first question just is, what advice would you give to a Leaving Cert student who likes the subject of history but is worried about a future career when people tell you your job choice is limited? So I don't know if you can see that there, Finbar.
Sorry, I'm just.
So essentially, I think it's a question about what are the career prospects from your perspective. What advice would you give to a Leaving Cert student who's interested in history?
I think there's lots of options. I'm not the best person, I would say, in terms of talking about a traditional career in history. I don't actually have a degree in history. I have a degree, as I said, in archaeology and Greek and Roman civilization, and people assume that they're, oh, it's all history. It's not. Believe me, it took me a long time to come to terms with like the differences and different approach. I think, like, I would say that like there are alternative careers. I suppose what I've done, they're not. I would be reticent to say that like, yeah, you'll definitely get a job. Like, if I started doing what I'm doing now, I don't know if I would be able to have a career in it. This sounds really disheartening, and I'm not trying to do that. No. You know, where people have always found jobs in history is in like teaching. Like, if you do a degree in history, it doesn't mean you may not always work in history, but it will stand to you. So if someone is saying, oh, you'll never get a job in that, well, maybe you might end up working in another field. Like if you look at where people in history departments end up working, they work in lots of diverse places. But at the same time, if you do your degree in history, you will learn a lot more about the possibilities of jobs. The one thing I would say as well is when I did my degree was in 2000, I did a master's in 2004. If you had told me that I was making a career doing what I'm doing now, I would have said that's mad, it's impossible. And I like the internet is going to continuously change the way we engage with subjects like history. I would say is definitely pursue it, but also be aware that it's not just, you know, yeah, don't let other people discourage you, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and just, I suppose, to second that point, I mean, I have some knowledge of this because we trace where our graduates go. So the graduates from our program are English and history, and they end up in all sorts of careers. You've mentioned teaching, yes, but also, in media, in the civil service, in journalism. There's in Google. It's in the IT sector. The skills that you get as an historian are very applicable now. And as technology improves and as coding becomes less important, as applications are more easier to use, it's more about the content creation and the skills of argument and discussion and projection of ideas that are more important in those companies. And historians and arts and humanities graduates in general are becoming increasingly hot property for those type of sectors. So you're not limited at all, I think, by having a history degree. As Finn says, you don't just have to do history. It can lead you to lots of different things. So I might just ask, the next question is, okay, so this is, I think, from a historian, actually, one of our own, I think, says, one of my pet peeves is when people use the word medieval as a synonym for backward or barbaric. Does Finbar find that there is a demand for medieval stories that tend to feed into this misconception? Does this limit the topics that are commercially viable? Is it possible to get audiences interested in the riches of the medieval period, such as the music, artifacts, and literature, and the sophistication of the medieval worldview? What a question.
It actually makes me think about the way I portrayed the medieval period.
It's a veiled criticism.
No, I think actually, in my experience, the issue is engaging people with medieval history in general, because, say, from my perspective and what I would be doing, people will look at the title. So it's like a book, I suppose. So, if you see a book on a shelf and you see the issues where people see the 20th century, they tend to go for that. If they see the War of Independence within that, they'll go for that. And then a certain amount of people, when they see the medieval period, they do then find that, or they do find us just less appealing. Within that, I think again, like, it's been about 5 years since I've really focused on medieval history, but certainly what I've learned, certainly in the last couple of years, again, it's all about the stories and the way you portray the information. And I think it still comes down to the same. Yeah, it's easier to make an engaging narrative, potentially around a military campaign, or like, say, something like the Bruce invasion. It's a really great story. It's an invasion of Ireland in the early 14th century. But at the same time, there are ways of portraying culture and things like that. It's trickier. So I suppose, is it commercially viable? It's easier, and I suppose if time is money, to reinforce a preconceived ideas of the medieval world. Yeah, and I think what's actually, there's an interesting point in this, in that if you're doing what I'm doing, you're definitely more susceptible to the quote unquote market. Because you don't have an I suppose if you have institutional backing, you get that time to maybe delve into a topic in greater detail, whereas you're going to naturally, doing what I'm doing, I don't produce original research, or I tend to operate in what academics would produce, and do my own research within that. So I would go to archives, but I wouldn't be aiming in this space of a 30-minute podcast to present a whole new thesis on any topic.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. So third question then is, someone says, I'm a recently graduated film student and I'm starting to research my first film, which is an historical documentary. I always had a passion for history and archaeology. What advice would you give for those starting out in producing historical content? Research
is what I'd say, because it's really, I think, with the internet particularly, it's given the rise to really well produced, high quality, either sound design, video design, that's badly researched, and people, it can help to manipulate or cover over the lack of research. But I think really high quality research always comes through. So I guess there's a tendency with podcasts anyway, and I don't know much about video production, but to overly focus on the sound design, and then that is I think so. I would say if the research is right, and that everything flow from that.
Yeah, and I actually think maybe another point you made, Finbar, about finding the individual story and narrative that sort of exemplifies the larger historical moment. That might be good advice as well, because I think if you're doing a film, it's about the narrative, isn't it? And that finding that that comes through research, I suppose. Finding that individual story that maybe allows the audience a way into it might also be useful. I think that would apply to video as much as to sound. I think the good story. So fourth one then, is there anything you do to differentiate yourself from other podcasts? Interesting one.
Not intentionally. I don't think about going, to be honest, like the structure that I have is modeled on several other podcasts, and that it's a narrative, that's the one I tend to employ most of all. So the War of Independence started at the start of the Revolutionary period. It's going to go all the way up to the truce, and it's not podcasts didn't invent the chronological narrative, but no, it's not something I think about going, I need to be different. I think what you do need to do is I need to make a good episode, but it's not like differentiating myself from others is not really something that I would
okay. Do you feel that you're being sort of true to your voice though, or do you feel you've developed your own voice as an historian, as a podcaster, or
I don't really follow the question, sorry.
So that basically, I mean, the question is about differentiation, and have you ever felt that maybe that at times you were maybe trying to appeal to your audience too much, and that actually what you found was you stayed true to your own vision of history and your own voice and your own mode of expression, or has that had to evolve and adapt?
I don't feel like it's inevitable, I suppose, because it's all it's a two-way process, or it's a process of engagement. So naturally, I'm influenced by what people like and don't like in a show. If it's about content and I feel like I was right and someone just disagrees with me, well, they just disagree with me, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's good overall. But I wouldn't necessarily go, okay, I'm not going to make that again because that person disagrees with me. I think that's probably what makes it. That's what makes it interesting, I think, is that someone has opinions. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does. So just the fifth question then. So this is about historiography, I think. What is Finbar's take on the idea that Irish people, particularly the diaspora, like the underdog stroke victim role through history, and how it still relates to religious identity? So question about a perception, I think, that Irish people like the underdog or victim role through history.
Through history, if you look at Irish society in the 19th century and the 18th century, particularly as what we would probably call as modern Irish identity emerges, and when I say modern Irish identity, I don't mean Irish Catholic identity. I mean, it's not a great history. It's you struggle to find, I would tend to disagree largely. People like the underdog victim role, I don't know, when you read the history of the famine and the decades that follow it, it's quite difficult to look at a society that's anything other than deeply traumatized. And I think that is the overriding narrative. In terms of the diaspora, I actually think it can often be quite different, actually. I think in my experience, a good chunk of my listeners are in the US. And people there are quite a different in that it's not necessarily the victim, it's often one of overcoming adversity. And they tend to engage with the past in a quite a different, they tend to engage with the past in quite a different way. So the famine, while it's this horrific thing that happened, is kind of the start of a foundation story. So I don't necessarily, my experience of the diaspora is not necessarily one, it's more that idea of a people who have overcome adversity.
Okay, that's interesting. A question then more about the logistics of your podcasting. So in terms of the creative end of your podcast, what software do you use to put everything together? And would you have any advice for beginner creatives? How do you put all your stuff together?
This now is where I'm at a weak spot. I have to say, I'm not great at I'm interested in history, and then I started to make a podcast, and sound design came afterwards. So I use Audacity to edit the show. That's a very simple audio editing software. It's very intuitive, kind of laid out almost like if you can imagine a Microsoft Word. Then in terms of recording, like, you can get very good microphones for very limited for very reasonable amounts of money these days. For the World Independence, I've started working with a sound engineer, and I guess that's because he's doing completely different things that are way beyond my ability on that front. So I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm almost not the person to ask, but I would say at the very start, if you download Audacity, it's free to download, and you just even record onto your phone and start editing that in it. I would say probably don't record podcasts on phones. The standard of podcast is probably moving beyond that now, and but you will get a microphone for less than, say, I'm not saying €100 is cheap, but you like previously would have had to spend a lot more than that. Like, you could spend any amount, spend $5,000 on a microphone. I wouldn't recommend doing that if you're starting a podcast though. Okay,
folks, we have about 10 questions outstanding here, and we have about 20 minutes max left. So I'm going to have to, if you have another question, maybe hit up Finbar on Twitter or something. I don't know if that's okay, Finbar, for them to do that.
Yeah.
But I think we'll maybe put a cap on the questions, and I'll try to get through the questions that have already been asked, because I know some people have had the question up for a while. So I'm going to paraphrase this question just because it's a bit long. So it's a question about essentially kind of far right versions of history, and are there enough voices combating unreliable sort of far right, maybe slightly extremist nationalist narratives about history in your experience?
Is there enough people combating
those? Yeah. So the question was about kind of, I suppose maybe what we discussed earlier, alt-right versions of history. Is there enough, I suppose, maybe evidential history to sort of combat?
Yeah, I think at the moment, I don't necessarily see that as a problem right now. I think it is going to be, as those movements grow, there will be people in third level institutions eventually. It'll take time. It might seem really difficult or distant now, but it will happen. Like, there's been like controversial books, for example, written recently enough on an aspect of the Second World War. There's a very controversial book that came out of Trinity on this that got very heavily criticized by other historians on the period. And I'm not saying that is what I'm talking about. I'm just saying that, like, we're probably entering into a period where there's going to be also money put up for this kind of history by foundations, so it'll appear in a much more legitimate way. Then alternatively, I think where the short term, it's not that it's not being challenged by history, but in sites like Audible, who are one of the biggest audio book providers in the world, and also in podcasting platforms like Apple, are continuously mixing counterfactual history, conspiracy theories in a topic in the subject area, history. So if you go into Audible, click on history, you're going to get all sorts of and sometimes, for example, you'll get a good example of this could be a history of medieval Europe that poses medieval Europe as this battle of civilizations, and the Crusades is this battle of civilizations between Muslims on one hand, Christians on the other, and no one in between. And the Christians were these decent people going out to the Middle East in this narrative that's just not borne out by history. So that does exist. I feel it is being challenged now. I think the bigger challenge is probably in 5 or 10 years' time, as you get the emergence of these fields of history in maybe isolation enough, but in third level departments. And also then, there's one aspect I do think it gets passed up on a bit is on some news stations where presenters will make comments about history, like George Hook used to do it, make comments about British colonial history, in like particularly about Kenya. I don't know why he used to refer to the Mau Mau in Kenya being like I don't know, like the way they fought against the British. And it's like, do you realize what the British government did in Kenya? Like, it's one of the most horrific things. So those maybe, and those ideas not being challenged, but I think it's more in a medium to long term is where this is going to become a really big issue.
Interesting. Another questioner says, I think this is obviously a Leaving Cert student. I really love European history, but not so much Irish or world history.
Yeah.
Would a degree be suited to me if I have to do modules in all these types of history? It's really European that I'm interested in.
You know, I don't want to actually answer that because I'm not, I'd say the best thing you could do is contact a third level institution, history department, because I wouldn't know enough about that. I'm sorry.
Yes. So I'd actually say to that commenter, contact us if you want. We can tell you more about that, and we can get one of our own historians to answer that question for you. So I want to make sure I'm in the right order here. So when you listen to a podcast, what do you look for in the podcast? Also, please send best wishes to Bill from our cats, Matty and Faith, who love his updates. I'm not sure what that refers to.
Bill is my dog.
Oh, is it? Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. So a little bit of in-house humor there. Okay. So the question is, when you listen to a podcast, what do you look for in the podcast?
What do I actually, to be honest, when I listen to podcasts, I like things that really like take me out of the present. Or if I often find it quite hard to listen to podcasts if I'm in the middle of making one, and it just stresses me out that I'm so far away from releasing it. I listen to quite random things as well. I listen to way too much true crime, which is not good for your headspace. Good stories, I think, or good storytelling is probably. I think, like, I saw someone comment on that. Like, that is the essence of a lot of podcasting, and I think it is. Like, you know, it's in a way, you know, that same way that people sat around fires. I mean, Blind Boys often said this. You know, the idea that people sat around fires back 100 years ago, telling a story, and I think it probably taps into something similar. Like, you know. It
speaks maybe to the oral history of our, particularly in Ireland, actually, a very strong oral history tradition, I think.
Yeah.
So another person asks, Finbar, you mentioned you worked in archaeology. Would you ever do a podcast centered around archaeological findings on a site, looking at the final archaeological reports of sites? I am also an archaeologist.
There's a great archaeology podcast called Amplify Archaeology that Neil Jackman makes, and Neil is still an archaeologist and is a far better archaeologist than I ever was. So I did make one that kind of touched on archaeology. It was a 6-part series on bog body. I don't know if I'd go through. I am kind of toying with the idea of doing one on prehistory, which would obviously be a lot of archaeology, or will be archaeology based. I don't know if I would make one out of a report into a site. It's not something that I've ever thought about. I'll think about it.
Yeah, interesting. Another question asks, Finbar, were you nervous taking a course in archaeology or a course that hasn't as such a specific career? Or would you back up what they say to study what you love and it will grow from there?
I wasn't. Maybe I should have been. But no, like I think you have to study. You have to have an interest in what you study, because you like, if you're going to do it properly, you're going to spend 3 years reading thousands and thousands of pages of either books or articles. You're going to spend 3 years thinking about this area. If you don't have an interest in it, well, maybe you'll sustain 3 years studying it. Are you going to be able to spend a career working in it? And I accept that not everyone gets to work in what they like, but I think the idea that you should just go into something because there's a good job, it's probably not a great idea, because you probably won't excel at that job. And like, I think we discussed this earlier, but if you do a degree in something, maybe you won't necessarily use that, but like an awful lot of jobs in like even things like the tech sector tend to look for degrees in things like the arts that will have, because if you learn, like say for example, if you study archaeology, you're going to learn a lot about like critical thinking and things like that that are they're applicable to nearly any job that you. And I think that, yeah, just because you study, I would take the approach to study what you're interested in. If it's microbiology, you might not be able to use it. Well, actually, I was talking to someone recently who works in marketing around podcasting, and they've got a degree in genetics. So there you go. Like, I don't think when they started studying genetics that they thought they'd be doing what they're doing. But I think it is, if you're not interested in it, what are the chances that you'll stay with it? Like, you
know. I think this is a fan here. It says, keep up the excellent work, Finbar. How many hours of work goes into a typical podcast? What does your work day look like?
A typical podcast takes 50, 60 hours, maybe, all going well. That's like from starting the research, but like at the moment I'm writing 3 at the same time. So my typical day involves, I tend to get up quite early, so I get up maybe about 5:30, and I work till about 4 or 3 or 4. I sit at a computer and write. Previously, I would have spent time going in and out of archives, getting material. Obviously, that's not possible. Breaks include taking the aforementioned Bill for a walk. But yeah, like my day to day is pretty boring. Well, I find it very interesting, but I don't have anything very interesting. You know, it's a pretty, as you might expect, a lot of it. To be honest, the main end of what I do is writing. I write a script, and that takes, you know, recording the podcast takes an hour at most. Editing takes a couple of hours. You know, so it's not that end of it is very, very, it's a tiny minority of what I
do. Just the final 2 questions now, folks, because we do need to wrap it up. How important was your locality and seeing history around you in Castlecomer, the mines, and that of Kilkenny in general, to pursuing your passion?
Yeah, I think it probably was, in retrospect, very important. I grew up in Castlecomer in North Kilkenny, and there was a strong sense of history in that community. It's a very strong sense of recent history. The mines, the town had been built around it, closed down in the late 60s, and people used to talk a lot when I was, like, even in the 80s and 90s, like older people used to talk a lot about the mines, and it would be mentioned an awful lot. And then there was a much wider sense of history about where the town had come from and the local landlords who were gone. And then in Kilkenny in general, like obviously there's a huge amount of medieval history in Kilkenny that survives in the landscape, and that definitely, you know, between up into Laois as well, that I would have spent a lot of time in and around those. And I think, you know, I wouldn't have known the history necessarily, but it begs that question: where did all this come from?
Very interesting. And finally, this is a big question, a zinger, I think. How would you improve the Leaving Cert history course? And what is the most critical skill as an historian? So it's actually 2 questions to finish. First of all, how would you improve the Leaving Cert history course? Maybe you haven't thought about that, or maybe you have.
Yeah, I think huge strides are being made. Like I think huge strides have been made, and it's heading in the right direction. I think maybe it's more about the entire Leaving Cert exam, maybe, is the issue, not just history, in that, like, so much is staked on this, like, whatever it is, couple of hours. Like you're supposed to, what, like 2 years or even longer, really, of your previous study is supposed to be encapsulated into this, and it's just lots of people aren't great at doing like written exams. It's just not and it doesn't, to be honest, if you're not good at written exams, it's pretty meaningless in terms of like your ability to do other jobs. Like you could be great at like working on it on a day-to-day basis. You just can't go in and cram. So I think for me, it's not so much about the, like, I think making it more practical, making it more engaging, you can always be working on it. Like, and I think, like, for example, you know, you could use the idea of, like, you know, mixing it, you know, cross-disciplinary kind of approaches, like, you know, where, you know, if students are making something like a podcast on history, they're probably going to engage with the topic in a different way than if they're to go in and write down this, you know, essay. But I think it has improved, and it is continuing to improve. And what was the second?
What's the most important critical skill as an historian?
Never trust anything, I suppose. Like, I guess just be constantly critical of like any source, like, you know, and I think that's really important in history. People, you see it, and it comes across a lot that people do things like they, for example, will trust a government report because it's a government report. And for Irish history, that's particularly problematic because there's an entire narrative, or there's multiple narratives realistically on this island of history that are not the official, that will not be contained in official government reports of, you know, those produced in London, like, and be they, like, for example, Irish Catholic narratives, or that will come out of those communities, like Protestant communities in the 26 counties, like loyalist communities, particularly, and, you know, like all these narratives are not often, are often the government reports produced in London are just completely wrong, or poorly, don't understand, are misinformed. So I guess that's just one example that, like, to understand our history, you have to be constantly critical of all sources. And even what's someone recently said it, and it's so true. People often go revisionist history, you know, like history that goes back, and all history is revisionist. But like, if you see a book that has things that you might think you disagree with, just read the book anyway, and just you might confirm, but you'll probably learn something from it. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying read like conspiracy theories, but like, you know, if you read histories that are in favor, maybe, you know, if you, for example, favor the Republican narrative on the War of Independence, and you come across a book that's like from a home rule perspective or a unionist perspective, just because you read the book, it doesn't mean that you're supportive, or, you know, history is not about the present. You can read, history is about knowledge, you know, and you need to understand the past and read.
I think that point is a great one to finish on, that be critical and be skeptical, but also be open to the other side of the arguments. I think as a message for us in 2021 is a really good, it's a really good way to end the discussion. So I just want to thank Finbar. Obviously, we can't give a round of applause, but just from the level of questions that we got, and we couldn't get through all of them, really stimulating discussion. And I certainly really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Thanks for taking the time out of your day, Finbar. And is there anything you want to promote finally, or sort of point us to that's coming up?
I probably do, but I can't think about it. Sure. If you listen to the podcast, you can find it at Irish.
Okay. Find them on Twitter, Facebook, all central social media platforms.
Yeah, you can find me at Irish History on Twitter. I don't use I have a Facebook page, but I left Facebook about 3 years ago and I haven't gone back. So.
Okay, great. And we've just had from thanks Finbar and Simon for this very interesting discussion. Thanks for answering the question. So that's great feedback. Okay, folks, thanks very much, and thanks for everyone else for attending. And we'll close down the meeting here. Thank you.